Hello and welcome to The Food Chain from the BBC World Service. I'm Ruth Alexander, and today we're asking, what time should you eat dinner? In some parts of the world, the evening meal is served at 6 o'clock sharp, in others as early as 4 o'clock. Elsewhere, not till 9 or 10 o'clock, even later. But when it comes to your health, is there a best time? Joining me today are Dr. Emily Manoogian, a scientist from the Salk Institute in California. She's an expert in the circadian rhythm.
Hi, welcome to be here.
Sarah Berry, a professor of nutrition from King's College London.
Hi, Ruth.
And Professor Jeffrey Pilcher, a food historian from the University of Toronto in Canada.
Hello.
So, I've got to ask you all, what time did you have dinner yourself yesterday?
Oh, good question. You know, humans are actually very bad at knowing when they ate unless you write it down. But I think I actually ate around 6:15 last night.
That's very precise.
It was because I got my daughter home from dance class and then we ate right when we got home. So I have a marker there.
Sarah, how about you?
I would say, I had my dinner about 8, and it was dictated as well by my childcare duties that I took my son karting, and that's when we got back from karting. When I had my last meal is a whole different matter. So I'm quite a snacker, so I probably was snacking away until probably about 10:30. Not that I'm advocating for snacking here, Ruth, but giving you an honest answer.
Not just me then. I had some toast and honey about that time. Having had my main meal about 5 o'clock, then I found I was a little bit hungry later. Jeffrey, what time did you eat last night?
About 6. I something around there.
So my next question is, when should you eat dinner? Emily?
Really, it's not any specific time on a clock. There's no universal magic hour. From our point of view, at least, and I think really what's driving everything is the circadian system, which is an anticipatory system which helps your body prepare for what it needs to do. And that is coordinated by the light that you're around, by your sleep-wake schedules, all those other kinds of things. So depending on your environment and your schedules, everyone's going to have a little bit different time. And I think the kind of easiest way to cheat that answer is to say it should end at least 3 or 4 hours before you go to bed. So if you're going to bed at midnight, you should stop eating by 8 or 9.
Right, okay. So it's slightly different for everybody, but that is a good rule of thumb, 3 or 4 hours before bedtime.
And I think, Ruth, another point to add to what Emily said is, I think thinking about when you have your last meal should also take into consideration when you have your first meal. We now know that having a smaller eating window and a period overnight of at least 12 hours when your body is at rest, your body is not digesting food, for example, is beneficial for health. And so if you are someone that gets up early and is having your breakfast at 6 a.m., for example, you might want to consider bringing forward your last meal a little bit earlier.
To what kind of time? 6 p.m. Oh, no, you would have to finish at 6 p.m. So maybe 5 p.m.
Usually it's recommended to be like a 10 or 11 hour eating window. So if you're starting your breakfast at 6 a.m., you should probably be ending by 4 or 5. 6, I would say, is the latest you should be consuming something. I think longer than a 12-hour window, we see kind of some negative effects there. And usually the other side of that is because you're still trying to adjust it to your sleep because of melatonin levels and other things that are going on, we usually recommend people waiting at least an hour after they wake up to start eating. And so you kind of get this, if you say you're in bed for 8 hours and then you don't eat for 3 hours before and 1 hour after you wake up, that's already a 12-hour window. If you just stuck to that 12 hours, you'd probably be fine. We usually recommend shortening it to 8 to 10 hours. I think 10 hours is perfectly reasonable and feasible for most people. Then you get this kind of magic window. So then you can say, okay, in that 12-hour span, when do I need to eat? Is it I have dinner with my family at 6 or 7? Because we're never going to say don't eat dinner with your family. That's not feasible. It's not a great way to do it. So if you're having dinner with your family at 6:30 and you want to count backwards, maybe you're doing 8:30 to 6:30, something along those lines. But just like Sarah said, if you're starting to eat at 6 because maybe you woke up at 5, and there are early birds like that, then yeah, you probably should be ending your dinner a lot earlier, and you're also going to be going to bed a lot earlier.
Jeffrey, if our bodies are set up to eat relatively early in the day, why is it that in so many places in the world we eat late?
Well, let me start by just saying that the whole idea of the meal is relatively modern. For the first 200,000 years, humans ate what was called a one continuous picnic, right? Where hunter-gatherers would just munch whatever they found as they wandered through the landscape. And so it was only with the origins of agriculture about 10,000 years ago that it became convenient to break up the food preparation into meals. And for most people, you would have a meal before you started work and a meal when you came back from the fields, because most people were farmers. And as societies became more stratified, then people who were wealthy and powerful would eat their meals, and when other people couldn't, as kind of a way of claiming status. And so the ancient Romans and medieval nobles, the Chinese emperor, would all eat their meals in the midday. And not that they wouldn't have other kind of snacks later on, and certainly they would. But in some ways, the dinner as such is sort of a more industrial, I think, phenomenon of eating meals, large meals later on.
Ruth, I think you also raised something really important with Jeffrey, which is about how different countries have quite different eating patterns. And people often say to me, but hold on, in the Mediterranean, they all eat a lot later, and look, they're so much healthier. Well, what they're eating is healthier. The rest of their lifestyle often is healthier. But actually, if you look at the distribution of their calories over the day, whilst they're eating later, the distribution is very different. So many Mediterranean countries, so Spain, Portugal, France, and so forth, they tend to have their largest meal, so the most calorie dense meal, actually at lunchtime. And so, yes, while they're eating later in the day, they're actually consuming less in the evening than, for example, we are in the UK or people are in the US. And there's now some good evidence from clinical trials showing actually it's not just so much the timing, it's also the weighting, so the distribution. So if you're kind of front loading your calories, so having more of your calories at breakfast and lunchtime compared to having more of your calories maybe at lunch and evening time, that's associated with less hunger, better metabolic health, fewer calorie intake.
So, and what kind of health problems can you end up with then if you eat too close to the time you sleep and your body just isn't ready for that food, can't handle it? Sarah?
So this is still an area of emerging evidence. What we do know, like Emily said, is how you metabolize the food is different. So you have bigger blood sugar responses, bigger dips. You have differences in hormonal responses to food. You potentially have greater inflammatory responses as well after eating, etc. And so what we know then from large population studies is that those people who are eating later in the day, because of these differences that we see mechanistically, are more likely to have poorer metabolic health. So they're more likely, for example, to have higher blood pressure, potentially higher cholesterol, higher rates of type 2 diabetes, and so forth. There aren't robust clinical trials yet, with these clinical endpoints, but we know there's this mechanistic link, and we know populations and groups of individuals within populations who are eating later tend to have a higher risk of many of these chronic diseases. I think that it's likely that inflammation underpins much of this, but yeah, time will tell.
Emily, you were talking about how people can end up eating later, because the sun's shining outside, in some countries. Can the body adapt to eating later on and closer to bedtime, or is it just always going to be a biological problem?
So you can kind of adjust your body's rhythms to some extent. It takes in light, food, activity. Those are the three main things that are going to affect your biological clocks and going to kind of set that time. the more consistent they are, the more robust and higher amplitude you can have of those rhythms. But again, it's gonna actively make it so you shouldn't be eating at night on purpose, right? Because when you're fasting, you don't have sugar coming into your body, right? And so you have to be able to, you don't want a lot of insulin going around that would take any sugar that got into the blood out of the blood. So insulin secretion is actually suppressed by melatonin, which is also suppressed by light, right? So as things get dark, melatonin gets higher, and that actually suppresses insulin. So then you can't really take glucose out of the blood very quickly. But at the same time, that allows you to break down fat that you're storing, break down other energy stores that you have during the night. And so getting that kind of fast in allows your body to properly do that. It also allows you to do other things in the body, like, repairing the lining of your gut. If you've got food coming through there all the time, you're not going to be able to properly repair that. It's like trying to repair a road without actually closing it. It's not going to work very well. And if you think of it as a stimulant too, you're kind of giving these mixed signals to when your body should be awake, right? And so the more you can kind of align all of these behaviors, align the light with the food and your activity, the better the system can kind of work. And then you'll be able to process food better. You'll be able to break down more fats. All these things kind of come together. And it can be shifted a bit, of course, but there's limits to that. You still need to make sure you're getting enough sleep, and it needs to somewhat align with the light.
Jeffrey, do you think some of our ancestors maybe knew some of this instinctively, like back in the day? Do you think people were once more likely to eat like with their body rhythms?
Well, I think that if they did, it was really more accidental. I mean, that was their life, and it just happened to coincide with what was very healthy. In terms of modern changes, right, and the ways that industrialization has imposed all of these rhythms of of the time clock and the school bill, which teaches us time discipline. These were sort of created to for more efficient factory production, and of course for people, especially people who may be on that second or third shift, that throws everything out of whack. But it comes to be about the efficiency of the system rather than necessarily the well-being of the workers who are in it. So I think that I think humans are on the whole pretty aware of what is going on within their bodies, and so. But then there's a lot of social pressure as well, which may sort of influence us to do other things.
I was just going to say really quickly, I think the social impact is actually huge. And I think when we had industrialization, we had lights available 24 hours, and we had refrigerators available, and you had access to food whenever you wanted it. That really changed a lot of things, because a lot of times we're not eating because we're hungry. We're eating because of a social event, or because of our schedules that dictate it, or because, it's fun, or an emotional eating, or some other type of reason that isn't actually hunger or need. And I think one thing to keep in mind is it's not like circadian rhythms are unique to humans at all. All forms of life have circadian rhythms. And if you look at animals in the wild, they have times of days that they eat, and they have times of days that they fast. And so this is kind of an inherent way that life works. Even when you look at plants and algae and single cell bacteria, they all have these circadian rhythms, and those things dictate when they eat, when they avoid predators, all those types of things. So I do think a lot of our more erratic eating patterns, our later eating patterns, most of it is due to schedule. And whenever we've run clinical trials with participants, we've never found someone who couldn't actually fit to a 10-hour window because it was physically demanding. It was people couldn't do it because of social pressures. They had to pick care of their kids in the morning, and they had to work late at night, or had to do a exercise late. And then by the time they got to make their dinner, it was too late to do it. It wasn't because they couldn't physically. It always came back to kind of this external pressures, these social, schedules and work schedules and all those types of things that kind of dictated when they ate.
Which is precisely what you and Sarah said at the beginning about why you ate late. And I ate late because I went out to the theatre, and I guess electricity allowed me to do that. what's a night shift worker to do, Sarah?
Well, it's tough. We know that shift workers are at increased risk of many metabolic diseases, so increased risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, more likely to have high blood pressure, and so forth. And it's a very difficult problem to solve for, given that more and more of us are night shift workers. And given that you often, as a night shift worker, are also having an erratic sleeping pattern, and so you might do 3 nights on, 3 nights off, etc. You might have family that you're then looking after on your other 3 nights, so you're not getting the consistency that Emily talked about, as well as the fact that you're eating out of line with your circadian rhythm, out of line with your body clock. There are some practical things that you can do, and there's been some really interesting studies both in the US and the UK looking at how can we improve the health of shift workers. There is no silver bullet though, Ruth. It all boils down to the fact that you have to be even more mindful than ever about the food that you're eating. Be more mindful about having refined carbohydrates, because we know, as Emily said, that if you're having refined carbohydrates, you're more likely to have a bigger blood sugar peak. That's more likely to lead to a big blood sugar dip. We know if you have a big blood sugar dip, it just sets you off on a roller coaster. Yeah, so ideally what you would do, what we would all do, but I think this is even more pertinent for shift workers, you would build meals that have a balance of healthy fats, so these are your mono and polyunsaturated fats, so extra virgin olive oil, oily fish, avocados, those kind of sources. You would have a healthy source of protein, ideally plant-based proteins, that you're also getting plenty of fibre that also balances out your absorption, your digestion. So this could be from nuts, from seeds, from whole grain sources. So swapping white rice, white pasta, white bread for whole grain sources of those, having beans and pulses, and then making sure that you're having plenty of minimally processed other plant-based foods, so fruits and vegetables. And it's really about making sure that that is dominating your plate, rather than heavily processed, rapidly absorbable food, rapidly digested food that's going to put you on kind of a blood glucose roller coaster, really kind of stress out your hormones that are already going to be struggling overnight.
A problem I have is that if I try and eat 3 or 4 hours before I go to sleep, I often find I'm then hungry as I get into bed. And, that way late night snacking lies, and all the sorts of foods that you're saying that we shouldn't have. So what advice do you have for a kind of thing you can eat at dinner time that will fill you up for a long time, see you through for right into bedtime and beyond?
So my first piece of advice would be to have a decent amount of food. So eat until you're full. A lot of the time people are hungry later or snacking because actually they're just not having a big enough main meal.
Can dessert be a good idea?
If it's a healthy dessert and you enjoy it, absolutely. I think building your meals around having lots of fibre in it, lots of protein in it, and healthy fats. What that does is it delays the rate at which your stomach empties. It means that you're absorbing the food more slowly. The other thing is and I know this is quite obvious to people, but again, really focusing on the minimally processed foods. And the reason for this is because we know if food is quite minimally processed, so in its whole form, as well as the stomach emptying it more slowly into our small intestine, what happens is a lot of it remains more intact as it passes through the small intestine, and it often reaches the lower parts of our small intestine where we have a lot more concentrated number of fullness receptors. So for example, whole nuts, whole seeds, whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole pulses, you tend to absorb them lower down the gastrointestinal tract. They're absorbed more slowly, and then you have this more slow feedback signal of fullness. And I think these are kind of simple things that we can do.
So it's not enough to think about just like when you eat your main meal. You've really got to think about what it is as well, if you're going to have any kind of success with this timing strategy.
Absolutely. We could do exactly as Emily said, we could finish 3 hours before bedtime. But if you are having white bread with no protein source, fat source with it, crisps, that kind of thing, whoa, you're going to feel hungry in about 60 minutes. Most people will, because you're digesting it so quickly, and it's not healthy for you anyway.
And I think, Ruth, you had mentioned, you start to feel hungry after, and 100% what Sarah said. If you don't have a satiating meal, then of course that's going to happen. But also, because the system's anticipatory, if it thinks you're going to eat, it can sometimes take 2 or 3 weeks for your body to not expect food anymore at that time. And so sometimes it's better to just move it forward a little bit at a time rather than jumping all the way in. But if you resist that craving and the more consistent you stay, those hunger cues at night will kind of just go away.
Do you imagine, whole cultures changing, rearranging their eating patterns as we get to know more and more about the science of what eating at certain times does to our bodies? Could you imagine that change happening?
Oh, absolutely. Because when we think about it, a lot of these changes are ones that have already happened, right? And there are societies that haven't made that change to a strong, big evening meal. In Germany, children still go home from school for the Mittagsessen, right? The main meal during the middle of the day. And workers or university students will eat at the canteen. And then the evening meal is Abendbrot, right? Just bread in the evening. And of course, in Germany, it's all whole wheat bread. So that very dense, very, very healthy things. And so that's a society where they have held on to those things. China is much the same way, where that big midday meal under communism, people still went home to have that meal and maybe to even take a little siesta. And today they may be working at the we're taking that big meal at the desk, but at least it is still, kind of done in that way. And so, yeah, I think that absolutely it is possible to change.
Emily, what final piece of advice would you have to someone listening who has got a really busy home life that, do long working hours and they have to ferry the children around to different activities? How, when you are busy with so many competing demands, can you arrange your life so that you can eat 3 or 4 hours before bedtime?
Emily, I'm glad you've been asked that one.
Yeah. I think a lot of us on this call have that situation. And I think so many people do. And really, I think one of the main things is meal planning. And it sounds so simple, but if you know what you're going to eat and when you think ahead of time and say, this is when I have time to cook it. So on a night I'm going to get home late, I already have it cooked and I can just warm it up so I can eat it quickly rather than spending an hour and a half to cook it. Or sharing off cooking responsibilities with another housemate or spouse or whatever. Those things go such a far way. If I don't meal plan, I cannot stick to my schedule. So I think meal planning is super important. It also helps you make better decisions about the types of foods that you're eating because you're doing it when you're not just starving and need to grab something quickly. So you can make more, it's easier to make healthier decisions kind of objectively. And one thing I want to say that we hadn't covered yet is we also crave worse quality foods later at night. There's some really interesting research that shows as it gets later in the night, we actually will crave saltier, fattier, less quality foods. You're not really craving a salad or a whole wheat piece of toast or some lean chicken at night. And so when you do make it so you don't eat enough at dinner, just like Sarah said, then when you do get hungry at night, you're usually going for something that's not very high quality. So what I would say is figure out what your typical sleep time is. Try to make that as consistent as possible. Work backwards from there. Find when you're eating dinner with your family and what works with that. And then, set a 10-hour window from that. I think there have been some research on meal frequency and other things like that. It seems like 3 meals a day with a snack or something along those lines that's kept consistent in a reasonable window. Ideally, if it's light outside, but really to fit to your schedule more than anything, that really can go a long way to improve your health.
Sarah, what would your tip be? Your one tip for someone wanting to make a change, wanting to, allow, eat a little bit earlier, further away from bedtime. How could they at least nudge their way towards that this week?
I think it's about really focusing on what your last meal of the day is and making sure that it is substantial, so it is going to fill you up, making sure it's got nutrients in that will keep you full for longer, so protein, healthy fats, plenty of fibre, and really focus on eating foods that resemble the foods that they came from. That's the best way to know that they're in their original structure, so they will keep you fuller for longer, will be metabolised in a way that keeps you as healthy as possible. The problem is, Ruth, it's really difficult. We're surrounded by all these hyper-palatable, tasty food that Emily really rightly pointed out your brain actually craves later at night. And so, maybe the best thing is out of sight, out of mind. Don't have those foods in your house if possible. Now that's difficult if you have a husband like I do that wants to snack on our healthy stuff, or kids that sneak things into the house. But that's one strategy, is also making sure out on your table, out on your kitchen side, you have healthy snacks if you are going to snack later to go to. And actually, if you are choosing healthy snacks, they can actually significantly improve your health, having nuts, having seeds, having whole fruits, vegetables and so forth.
And you both confess to not getting it right all the time, or at least not last night anyway. Does that mean that, although consistency is key, you don't actually have to be perfect every single day?
You never have to be perfect. There's healthy ways to live. Like, you should exercise. You shouldn't, drink huge amounts of alcohol. You shouldn't eat ice cream all the time. Like, there's so many things in life that are wonderful that you can do that you shouldn't do all the time. And so you could kind of think about it like brushing your teeth. Like, you should brush your teeth every day, but if you didn't brush your teeth one night, you're not going to wake up with a mouthful of cavities the next morning, right? So like, it should be occasional that you cheat. It should try to be as consistent as possible. But if you need to eat late because you're at a celebration or some other kind of social event, or you've just had a day and that's what you need right then, I think that's fine. It's a matter of just don't overstarve yourself the next day. Just get back to your regular schedule the next day and try to get back on that track. And occasional unhealthy habits, if they're occasional, are really not so unhealthy.
Excellent advice. I will try to take at least some of it on board. Professor Sarah Berry, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thanks for thanks for inviting me. It's great to be part of a wonderful discussion with Jeffrey and Emily, so thank you.
And Emily Manoogian, thank you very much to you too.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. It was great talking with everyone.
And Professor Jeffrey Pilcher, thank you.
It was my pleasure. I really learned a lot.
And you can watch more episodes of The Food Chain here on YouTube, like the one where we asked, is breakfast really the most important meal of the day? We're available as a podcast every week too. Search for The Food Chain online or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.